Hi everyone, this video is part 5 of the memory series for AP Psychology students in the Unit 2 content about cognition. This particular lesson will focus on memory challenges. As you can see on the unit outline, we are at the end of the 2B series on memory, and you'll be happy to know this is the final video of Unit 2 as a whole. These are the key focus questions for today's video. By the end, you should be able to answer all of them. These are the vocabulary concepts you should take note of as you are listening to this video. So let's start with forgetting. In 1885, a researcher named Hermann Ebbinghaus studied how long our memory for new information lasts. He studied lists of nonsense syllables and then measured how much he retained over time, from 20 minutes to a month later. His results are famously known as the Hermann Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, and you can see them here on the screen. Initially, he found that the majority of the information that he learned was lost within an hour. And then over time, it slowly started to level off. You can see after about a month, he only retained about 20% of the information he learned. This is what we refer to as the forgetting curve. We can combat the forgetting curve with things like the spacing effect and the testing effect. As you already know, distributed practice or spacing out your review sessions can lead to more durable memories over time. And if in those spaced practices you practice retrieval or you test yourself, you can lead to a more durable, lasting memory over time and retain that information longer. As you can see on the diagram on the screen, the rate of forgetting is actually slowed and improved by spacing practice and spacing study over time. We cannot remember information that we never encoded in the first place. Sometimes memory loss happens before the actual memory process begins, which is what encoding failure is. We can't remember something that we never stored in the first place. It would be like trying to find a book on your shelf that you never bought, or trying to go access a video game on your console that you never actually purchased. So for instance, this happens all of the time with us. And I'll give you an example of a study that was done in 1979. Researchers asked participants to look at a series of images that were all illustrations of pennies, but all of them were slightly different. Words were in different places. The image of Abraham Lincoln was in a different spot. The date was in a different location on all of the pennies. And they asked the participants, who were all Americans, which one the real penny was. And they had a real difficult time doing this. And the reason was they could distinguish a copper coin with Abraham Lincoln from a silver dime or a silver larger quarter, because that was what was most important to them. But all of those little other elements, the details on the penny, were not important and were actually not encoded. So most of the participants could not pick out the actual penny because it wasn't important for them to know where the date was located or where the words were or which orientation the person's face was. What was important was the color and the shape, so it could distinguish that coin from other coins. So let's try this with a different example. I have illustrations of nickels on the screen, and I want you to think about which is the accurate depiction of the US nickel. Take a second to think about it, and if you don't want to hear the answer just yet, I want you to pause the video. So the correct answer is C. But I imagine this was really difficult for you because you probably didn't encode where all of these different elements were on that coin or that nickel because it wasn't important. A lot of times information just isn't encoded because we don't need it. But likely, if I were to put a nickel next to a penny and a quarter and ask you which one is the nickel, you absolutely could do that because you encoded what was important. So sometimes we do not remember information because we never encoded it at all. Sometimes we have difficulty retrieving a memory not because it wasn't encoded, but because something gets in the way when we are trying to retrieve it or interference occurs. There are two types of interference that you need to be familiar with: proactive interference and retroactive interference. So let's start with proactive interference. Think about what it's like when you start a new calendar year and you are writing down the new date and you accidentally write down the previous year's date instead of the new year's date. It wasn't that you didn't know you entered a new calendar year, but that old information blocked the new information. And so you remembered that old information and you picked that information up. You might have experienced proactive interference if you've ever moved to a new address. When you go to tell someone your new address, all you can remember is your old address. That would be another example of proactive interference. Or if you have ever changed lockers, if you've had one locker and you've used that combination for a year, and you go the following year to a new locker with a new combination, and you go to put in that combination, and all you can remember is your old locker combination, you've been affected by proactive interference, which occurs when old information blocks or hinders your ability to recall new information. The second type of interference that can cause memory failure is called retroactive interference. Retroactive interference happens when new information hinders or blocks the recall of older information. So, suppose you have to set a new password and you can't use your old password that you always use because this new program wants you to use special characters. So you come up with a new password and you work to remember your new password on that new device, but now maybe you're going back to sign into an old email address and you need to use that old password. But you can't remember it because all you can think of is the new password that you just created with these special characters. You have had a retroactive interference where new information is blocking your ability to recall old information. So on the screen, there's an example here about you have a sibling who is going to college and now they have a new email address and you've been emailing them at their new email address. And maybe your mom or someone asks you, hey, can you remember your sister's old email address? I want to send her a coupon. I want to send her to her personal account. And you can't remember it because you've been using her new account. What has happened is retroactive interference. You have new information that makes it difficult to recall the old information. Another common memory failure is called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. The tip of the tongue phenomenon happens when the information is encoded and it's stored, but when you go to retrieve it, you can't quite get it out, even though you feel like you almost can, or you feel like you can almost recall it. So the memory's stored, and maybe it's even partially retrieved, but it's not fully accessible. So you're usually in this tip of the tongue state when you can't quite get it, but maybe you even pick out parts of it. You might say something like, "Oh, I know what it is. I can feel it. It starts with a T. I just can't remember all of it." That would be someone in the tip of the tongue state. Researchers who have studied the tip of the tongue phenomenon have found that almost everyone experiences this, and usually about once a week. The tip of the tongue retrieval state happens more often as people get older, and it occurs more frequently when trying to recall names. The tip of the tongue state also happens commonly when someone can't quite remember the information, but they might remember the first letter or they might recall similar words. And when it comes to actually remembering the information that they're trying to recall in the tip of the tongue state, researchers have found that only about half of the time does the person actually figure out that information when they're in the tip of the tongue state. So, in summary, the tip of the tongue phenomenon happens when you can't fully retrieve the information, even though you feel like you can or you're going to. So now let's focus on inaccurate memories or false memories. To really understand this topic better, let's go through the process of how memories are kept and then how they're retrieved, because that's a really important part of how we can have inaccurate or false memories. So, as a reminder, our memories aren't flawless and they're not a recording. And when our brain takes in information, it doesn't take it in as an exact replica as what occurred. And when it's taking that information in, not everything is kept. What is kept through a process called consolidation. And this is a process where our memories are strengthened through sleep and they're taken in and solidified in our long term memory and stabilized through periods of sleep. And information can be distorted or can be interrupted. And it's also important just to highlight here the importance of sleep and that sleep disruption can impact our memories and can weaken our memories or cause incomplete memories. Now, another element of memory memory is then the process of pulling that memory back out, which is called constructive memory. And constructive memory refers to the method by which the information is pulled out of our mind. And it's not pulled out and then replayed like a recording, but rather it's pulled out in pieces. And those pieces are then rebuilt. And those pieces are built into what we say is our memory of what we recall. And sometimes we don't have all of the pieces, but we put them and we reconstruct them. And sometimes when we are reconstructing, as we're pulling that information out, our brain might fill in the gaps with prior knowledge or beliefs or other information that fits into that memory as we are remembering it. And that's the process of pulling that information out, and it's called constructive memory. And this process of recalling information as you're building that memory back together is this reconstructive process. And it's this process of putting fragments back together that was studied by a psychologist named Elizabeth Loftus. And one of her famous studies is called the misinformation effect, which she studied participants in 1974 and how they remembered events differently from one another and how that memory could be influenced by misinformation. So, what she did was she had participants watch a video of a car accident where two cars collide. And then she had her investigators question the participants about what happened in that particular event and asked them to recall the car accident. But those investigators used different words in their questioning. For example, the investigators asked the participants, how fast were the cars traveling when they smashed into each other versus how fast were the cars traveling when they contacted each other? And the participants who heard the word smashed as they were recalling the event recalled the cars traveling faster than the participants who heard the word collide or hit whenever they were asked about the car accident. In fact, participants who heard the word smashed were also more likely to describe seeing broken glass at the scene when there was none. And this study highlights how even just subtle changes in questioning can change how the people remember the event. As they're piecing that memory of the event back together, just the framing of the question can influence how they reconstruct that memory. And this also shows how fragile our memories are, and it can raise concerns for us about the reliability of eyewitness testimony and also the importance of not using suggestive language when questioning eyewitnesses of crimes or of events like this, because we are vulnerable to the misinformation effect, which is when misinformation is introduced as you are recalling a memory, the memory can be slightly altered or distorted. Another way we can have inaccurate memories is through something called imagination inflation, which is the phenomenon where imagining an event, especially if you imagine it in vivid detail, can increase the person's confidence that the event actually happened when it never did. This occurs because imagining the event can create this familiarity with it and can cause your brain to mistake that information and interpret that imagined information as real memories that happened to you. The process blurs the line between what's imagined and what truly happened and can lead to false memories. So, for example, if someone sees a photograph of a family vacation that they did not attend and they heard stories and stories retold about this particular vacation, over time, the combination of the photo and the repeated narratives could cause them to believe that they were present at that event. And they might remember playing on the beach or eating at a specific restaurant, even though those memories were constructed from the stories and the visual cues in the photo and not actually experiencing it themselves. This also further highlights how suggestion and imagination can shape and distort our memories. Another example where we have seen people produce inaccurate memories is through something that is called source amnesia. It's also called source misattribution, which occurs when a person recalls the information but cannot accurately recall the source or the origin of that information, whether it's trivia facts or rumors about a celebrity or even a song lyric. Sometimes we will remember that content, but then have difficulty remembering where we learned it or where it came from. And this is a really common common memory error that just highlights how our brain processes and stores information. The content of the memory stays intact, but then misunderstanding or forgetting the origin or being confused about where it came from is really, really common. And it can lead to misattributing where that fact came from. Maybe you thought you heard it from a news story when it was actually told to you by a friend, or you thought you learned it firsthand when really you heard it told to you in a class. And this is a really common form of inaccurate memories called source amnesia. Now, psychodynamic psychologists believe that forgetting happens because of something called repression, which is when your mind hides memories that are too upsetting or distressing. And this happens without you realizing it because your brain is trying to protect your conscious self. And the idea that psychodynamic psychologists try to explain is that the mind is protecting the conscious self and what you're aware of. And the process is through repression or pushing those distressing thoughts and memories out of your conscious mind. An example might be experiencing a traumatic event. And if you don't remember that traumatic event, a psychodynamic psychologist would say that your mind is protecting you from the pain by repressing that pain. And it has become a hidden memory, hidden away from your conscious self or your ego. Have you ever wondered why you are not able to remember things from infancy or maybe in your toddler years or even in your first few years of life? Well, the reason is something called infantile amnesia. And this is the natural inability to remember experiences from your first few years of life, typically before the ages of 3 and 4. And this occurs for a couple of different reasons. The first is because the brain is still developing, and particularly the hippocampus, which is responsible for forming long term memories, is not fully developed in infancy. And infants lack the language skills to structure and encode memories with language, and that usually helps us recall and retrieve memories more easily. And so, as children are growing and their language abilities are growing and their brain is maturing and their cognitive abilities mature, they are better able to store and then retrieve those memories. And so, this phenomenon helps us understand why, as adults, it's difficult to or almost impossible to recall our earliest experiences. Even though our brains were very active in processing and learning at that time, we weren't really able to effectively store them in a way that they could be retrieved later. Are cases of amnesia that are conditions that happen after brain damage or disease or illness that affects the brain. And two of these conditions that you need to be familiar with are retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. On the screen, you can see that there is an event at the center that is showing the onset of a disease or traumatic brain injury. And if you can see, retrograde amnesia is happening on the left side. So retrograde amnesia is a type of memory loss that occurs after a brain injury or traumatic event that results in the loss of memories before that event. But the individual will be able to form new memories after the event. They will just have difficulty recalling things that happened before the event. On the other hand, anterograde amnesia refers to the inability to form new memories after the event has occurred, while their memories from the past remain intact. A simple way to remember this is retro means backwards. So retrograde amnesia involves losing your past memories that happened before the event, where antero means moving forward. And I think of the song Ants Go Marching Two by Two, and I visualize ants moving forward. And that reminds me that anterograde amnesia involves the difficulty of creating new memories going forward after that event had occurred. Now, the final memory condition you need to be familiar with is Alzheimer's disease. But I want to back up just a little bit because Alzheimer's disease is under a broader category called dementia. And dementia is just a term that refers to conditions where memory and thinking are impaired and it affects daily functioning. So, dementia is a larger, more broad category, and Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia, and it's actually the most common type of dementia. And Alzheimer's disease it actually accounts for 60 to 80% of dementia cases. Alzheimer's disease is a progressive disorder that starts with mild forgetfulness and then begins to worsen over time, leading to more severe cognitive and functional impairments over time. And it's linked to the buildup of harmful proteins in the brain, which forms plaques and tingles, and it disrupts the brain cells' communication. And eventually, it leads to parts of the brain shrinking. And you can see this depicted on the diagram on the screen. The exact causes of Alzheimer's disease aren't fully understood, but are thought to involve a combination of factors: genetic, lifestyle, and environmental factors. But it does primarily affect older adults, typically over the age of 65, and is the leading cause of cognitive decline in aging populations. While there is no cure, there are treatments that can help manage the symptoms and improve the quality of life for those who are affected. So this brings us to the end of today's video. Let's do a few short questions for review. I'll read the questions and you'll need to pause the video to determine the answers. Question number 1 says, Suzanne gets a new phone number. Each time she tries to give someone the new number, she gives her old number instead. The fact that her old number is causing difficulty in her ability to remember the new one is an example of. Question number 2 says the cafeteria at Muhammad's school is a large room with 9 freestanding pillars that support the room. Muhammad has been in his school cafeteria hundreds of times. One day, Muhammad's teacher asks him how many pillars there are in the cafeteria. Muhammad has difficulty answering the question, but finally answers 6. What memory concept does this illustrate? Question number 3 says, which of the following is an example of anterograde amnesia? So this concludes today's video on memory challenges and forgetting. On the left-hand side of the screen are the answers to the review questions, and on the right-hand side of the screen, you can reread those key focus questions and review the key vocabulary concepts.